Welcome everyone to another episode of the Lofthouse Group Podcast, where we talk to leaders in architecture about emerging topics, interesting topics, and today is all about sustainability, which we will learn is a term that our guest today doesn't really like within architecture, but we'll come on to that anyway. But so I'm your host, Ryan Gorman, Director of Lofthouse Group. And today I'm really pleased to say that we're joined by Asif Din, who's the Sustainability Director at Perkins Will. For those who don't know, Perkins Will, global architecture practice, 2,500 plus staff across the world. And Asif leads, I'll let you explain what your role is, but Asif leads sustainability across the practice. But yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. So I probably should explain what I do in the firm. I actually oversee all of the projects in the office to make sure that they are all exploring all aspects of ecological design, let's say that. But yes, one of the things I don't particularly, well, as you've said, Ryan, I don't particularly like the word sustainability. Sustainability now is becoming a little bit too limiting a term for us to actually use within architecture. Just take the root word of sustain. Effectively, when we were talking about, sustainability in, say, the 1970s or the 1980s, it was about just getting to that 0 point to make sure that you're not doing any harm. We're no longer at that state anymore. It's sort of like, you're seeing firms coming and they're doing direct air capture. They're actually talking about positive contribution towards the environment. And we should be looking towards that regenerative type ideas to make sure that effectively we're going beyond that sustainability point, because if we're going beyond, if we're just doing sustainability, we're not going to tackle quite a lot of the world's problems as we have them at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's great that you mentioned that, because we're going to come on to whether or not we're going to hit the various targets that have been set by the government, and just whether as a profession architecture is on track to tackle some of these issues. But I suppose to start with, we'll go into your background and how you got to where you are. But first of all, what I think is really important is, because we're going to be talking a lot about sustainability, and the title of the podcast is of this episode is circularity versus sustainability. I think it would be really good just to lay the foundations and define a few of these terms for our audience. So would you mind just, I guess, as a starting point, explain what the circular economy means and what circularity means within like the built environment context?
Right. Okay. In terms of sort of like the systems within ecology, circularity is actually more to do with resource management than anything else. The idea of circularity is that you have two different streams. You have a biological stream that effectively cycles. Everybody's heard about the carbon cycle or the water cycle. You learn about that at school in terms of, rain falling on hills and then falling down into the sea and then it being evaporated up and then going round again. Now, there's biological cycles and there's also technological cycles. And in architecture, we're dealing quite a lot with the technological cycles, but what we're trying to do is trying to maintain the value of that technological cycle as much as possible within a closed loop. So essentially that's circularity, sort of in quick 1 minute terms.
Great. And because we're going to be talking about that a lot. And when it comes to the life cycle analysis within architecture, we just set a definition for that now as well.
Okay. Right. Anything that we do effectively has some sort of environmental impact. Now, the life cycle of a product, well, let's think of as a simple product, let's say like a brick. So first of all, it's dug out of the ground, it's clay, then it's taken to a factory, it's put into a mold, it's then fired, then it's delivered to site, installed, maintained perhaps while it's in situ, and then it's demolished. All of those bits are effectively a whole life cycle of that product. It's effectively from when it's born to when it, it's disposed of, when it dies. So that's called sort of like the cradle to grave type approach. But also within life cycle analysis, a range of other terms like cradle to gate. So from the moment it's sort of like dug out of the ground to where it leaves the factory gate. And then cradle to cradle, which is effectively that you go all the way around and you're trying to create that circularity. So you go all the way around and then you try to reuse the product again.
Great. Well, that's that. Well, now we have that set. It might make the rest of, we can talk probably more comfortably about all of these topics and areas, and people will have some context now, the listeners.
Right.
So let's go back to you, because I think that ultimately
Okay.
we're going to be learning about sustainability, but we want to learn about the man behind the legend. Because I see you all. I see you all over the place now on videos and interviews, and you're quite which is good, because there doesn't seem to be many people like publicly talking about sustainability within architecture, and yet kind of everyone kind of gives a bit of lip service to it about it being important, but not many people seem to be kind of talking about it on public platforms. So could you give us a bit of a background on how you got to where you are now as a sustainability director, and what it was about sustainability, and I'll keep using this word you don't want me to use, but sustainability within architecture that kind of drew you to that topic?
Right. Okay. Oh, right. Okay. Let's start from sort of like early days. So as a kid, I was interested in Lego, as most kids are, building stuff, but I got bored by quite a lot of stuff, quite honestly. So I didn't really have, and I wanted to do something that I knew didn't have such a tight focus that allowed me the leeway to explore different things, research different things, and to do something for, sort of like buildings, things that we actually use day to day.
Yeah.
Now, I went and I chose an architecture school at that time that had Robert and Brenda Vale there, who wrote The Autonomous House. And going into sort of architecture, I actually thought about, well, why do we still design houses essentially exactly the same way that we have done in Victorian era? We are not really thinking about them efficiently. We're not thinking of them really about the age, sort of like still modernism was effectively, used as effectively the way that we should be taught in architecture school, the Bauhaus type architecture approach or modernist type approach, the machine for living in. But in matter of fact, buildings are not really changed. And I suppose my grand vision was I wanted to tackle that.
Mm-hmm.
And part of doing that was looking more and more into how to make buildings more efficient, how to make them fit better into the environment. And fast forward, effectively, I left university. I was lucky enough to join Bill Dunster to work on BedZ, which was a groundbreaking project, because effectively the client allowed us to do so many innovative things on a single project. When we did BedZ, I think there was about 22 different innovations on a project. Normally, if you talk to any architect, they say, just you choose two. Just two innovative things on any project, enough. Mm-hmm. Don't do too many, otherwise it's bound to fail. We pushed it, and we pushed it really hard. But still, even today, it's put as an exemplar project, which is kind of a sad indictment, really, of where we are with housing, because that was 20 years ago that was completed, and yet we still haven't really moved that much forward.
Yeah, well, I guess that's going to lead on to what you're able to do in your role now at Perkins and Will. So could you give us an overview of because you're in the unique position where you are able to work across multiple sectors of projects. Yeah. And so you've got a good vision of sustainability across a range of different, I imagine, clients as well as building typologies. So could you just give us an overview of what your role is at Perkins and Will?
Right. At Perkins and Will, I've set up different systems, effectively, that people can report how their projects are doing. This allows me, as a toolbox, to go into those projects and explore different areas and help each one of the designers in individual ways to make sure that they target what's right for their client. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of like we're still paymasters to a client, essentially. And yes, we can do a certain amount that we want to do off our own backs to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I have done that at Perkins and Will in terms of setting up stage 2 reports. So end of concepts RIBA stage 2, at the end of concept stage, effectively going in and basically saying, how do you make this project zero operational carbon? Would you do a life cycle analysis report for this? What are the biggest hitters within that in terms of interiors, for say the interiors field? But after that, it's effectively making sure that the client and the designer are aligned, and we're exploring all of those things. So not everything has to cost money. Not everything is effectively driving against what the client actually wants. There's a lot of synergies there. They just need exploring properly.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there about how to get the buildings to can be zero carbon operational.
Yeah.
If the most of the carbon in a building is in the construction, right? So how important is I mean, you're probably going to argue with me here, right? You're probably going to know better, but how important, or how long would it take for you to offset the carbon cost of constructing the building if you've got a building that's then running efficiently once it's been built? Or is that possible? Can you offset the carbon cost of construction?
Ooh, we're getting into a bit of a complicated subject already. All right, okay, let's separate this out first. Where we're talking about the embodied carbon of the building, which is all of the bits and pieces that make it go together. And we're talking about the operational carbon of the building, what it takes for the building to run.
Yeah.
What's its bills, essentially. Now, as regulation has increased, the amount of operational carbon has gone down and down and down. But the embodied carbon effectively has gone up a little bit because you've had more insulation, more systems, other things put in. Now, in terms of the operational carbon, you can start putting things in to make sure that you're actually not offsetting that, is that you're providing that. So renewables, green energy, other bits and pieces. On the operational side, what do you do? How do you actually account for that carbon? It's actually quite difficult. You are almost into the fields of offsetting or trying to produce extra energy and saying that extra energy pays for that embodied carbon. All of that is effectively, sort of like, it's a little bit still the Wild West, quite honestly. To have a good offset is very, very varied. If you talk to an airline company, for example, some airline companies will say, oh, we provide offsets within the ticket price. That's not probably a real offset of what you're actually trying to, what the carbon that you're expending. On the other side, you have people like GLA who are basically saying that the carbon offset should be a certain amount. That amount of carbon is set as an energy carbon offset, almost. It's set as essentially, if you had a building, how much would that kilogram, ton of carbon be if you were going to provide that from solar power? And that becomes that offset. So that offset is probably 100 times bigger than the airline offset.
Wow.
So we're getting quite deep into the weeds now. It's sort of like, this is, effectively what I'm trying to explain to quite a lot of clients is effectively, you're not going to have really a zero carbon embodied building, but it's how you actually design it down. So you're minimizing the embodied carbon within the building, first of all, and then what means you're using to top that up that is robust, because you don't want to be turned around and basically say, well, you said you offset it, but does that really make sense?
It's such a huge topic, right? I think it's when you start to dig into the cost of the actual construction. Okay, so has there been a fundamental I'm struggling to get my words out now. So has there been a fundamental not misunderstanding, but when people have historically designed buildings or created buildings that are green or sustainable buildings, what I often see reported on is how they are, using the wind, or they're using natural energy to cool the buildings and so saving on air conditioning. But very, very rarely do I see much about how they're constructed. Can you offset the cost of building that building entirely by, I guess, passively by the way that it then is managed and run? Like, can you save enough energy to offset, I guess, because I'm assuming most buildings that have been built haven't all, even the ones that are considered sustainable or green, haven't all been built in the most efficient way possible by considering, the life cycle analysis of all of the materials going into it. So there are going to be buildings built that aren't necessarily being built sustainably, but are being run sustainably. Is running the building enough to kind of offset that, or do we need to be looking at the life cycle analysis as well? Is it enough?
Running a building efficiently probably would help you in terms of sort of like the operational carbon, and you can get to that zero carbon status, sort of like projects like BedZ, or sort of like leading projects that you see now in terms of in the environmental field. They will have a sort of a zero carbon, a true zero carbon sense that the amount of renewables over the course of a year will run the building. And that's called net zero carbon as a term, the net being over the course of a year. But there's still very, very few buildings at any one point in time will be zero carbon. So in winter on a cloudy day, your solar panels are not going to work. You're still going to rely on the grid or another means to provide that energy. It's going to be very hard to provide what, sort of like that peak load, sort of like, in housing, the established peak load is after the evening soap when everybody puts their kettles on.
Yeah.
And there's a peak there. Now, providing that peak is incredibly hard to do. And one of the tricks effectively within environmental architecture is to actually try to reduce those peaks as much as possible so that you're getting something that's reasonably even. Once you get something that's reasonably even, then you've got a chance of actually making, sort of like the renewables work properly and efficiently within the building.
Great. Okay. And when you're speaking to, I guess in terms of people's overall understanding of net zero and what they think sustainability is within architecture. So when you're speaking to a client or you're speaking to the team about making the building more efficient, are clients mostly interested, or are they mostly only aware of the running the building rather than the actual, are you kind of having to explain to them the actual concept of life cycle analysis as well? And how hard is it then to try and get them on board with that?
Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. The hardest clients are the ones that have separated out their pots of money very, very succinctly, sort of like the CapEx. What am I going to spend on the building? They're not bothered about effectively how much it costs to run.
Yeah.
They're just worried about how much is that going to cost to build? The easier clients to deal with effectively are the ones that actually have the CapEx and the OpEx together. Yeah. Because then you're saying that effectively, right, if you spend a little bit more in designing the building, it's going to be so much cheaper to run. And you're going to make those savings very, very quickly overall. Passive as, for example, sort of like in terms of energy, sort of like, well, sort of the systems you put in, I'd say probably it's around about 5 to 7 years. And then you pay for all of the systems, that additional cost that you put into the CapEx that you get from the OpEx.
Okay. A client's, because does it differ within sector as well? Because I imagine the client who's building the building, and I say like a hospital, right, or a public sector building where it's not just a client building something to invest it and sell it. Do they have a different approach, or are they more receptive to these ideas?
They are more receptive to these ideas, but also, sort of like hospitals and public, sort of public buildings are more prone to regulation, more prone to sort of like, this is the way we've always done it. Don't mess with the system. Do it this way. Yeah. Because otherwise we're going to have a hard ride later on down the line, because there is quite a lot of scrutiny, and rightly so, in terms of public buildings. But those, sort of like, it is trying to build in little things within those systems, within especially things like hospitals, to make sure that they run as efficiently as possible and they're easy to operate as possible. Okay. Sort of like we've all, sort of like, I like to use the old example of the VHS record, sort of video recorder. Can you remember those when you used to get a huge manual and you were trying to record one program in the evening and you had to go through about 30 different steps, pressing away, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing that effectively for architecture. Effectively, what we've got to do is get away with those 20 steps and effectively make it easy, make it so that the building can be run just with a quick couple of steps that are intuitive, rather than making it a difficult manual that nobody's going to read and that everybody's going to get frustrated by.
Do you think that it's the government's place to be stepping in and putting rules and regulations around how people build buildings in the interest of making things more sustainable, or is it should the benefit come from? Well, you might be able to answer this. Are sustainable materials more expensive? And if they are, should governments be forcing people to create greener buildings, or should be kind of using like free markets to encourage people to do that?
In times of crisis, the free market doesn't really work. Honestly, it's too slow a mechanism. Sort of like we had our opportunity. The UK government had its opportunity with Code for Sustainable Homes. It decided to scrap it. It decided to scrap its zero carbon buildings and basically say, let the market run. The market's running now. And in matter of fact, that lost time, we're not going to get back. So pessimistically, we're not going to have zero carbon buildings and we're going to miss our climate change targets, quite honestly.
Well, what needs to happen, like, to kind of get back on track?
Right. What's going to happen is there's going to be a short shock very, very soon. And very, very soon, effectively, things like risk analysis within finance and insurance are going to run the show. So there's going to be lots of people with stranded assets. These are effectively houses, offices, and other things that are not fit for the future. Now, the government has tried to do this with MEES, which is sort of like a minimum energy standard, and basically saying, we're going to slowly creep up the energy standard that's required for you to rent out something that's fit for purpose. Sooner or later, an insurance company is going to turn around and basically say, I'm not going to insure that because that's not going to be around in 10 years' time. It's not going to be fit for purpose. It's going to be something that effectively is a debt. It's a liability. And we're getting to that point quite soon. And it's going to be a bumpy road ahead. It's going to be a lot bumpier than it would have been if it was going to be driven by regulation. But regulation takes a long time. We had our opportunity, and I don't think we're going to get it back.
Oh, that's a shame. I was kind of hoping for,
I
was kind of hoping for a happier answer there. Oh, well. I guess for those who were listening who don't necessarily know, I did my PhD in green chemistry. So, and we've been chatting earlier about how there's quite a lot of overlaps between some of the, I guess the way that you approach sustainability. Mine was making pharmaceuticals cheaper so that they could, and more sustainable so that people could get more access to them. And the biggest problem I found when it came to sustainability was that everyone wanted a green solution, or they wanted something to be sustainable and the next best thing, and until they had to pay for it. And it was always that's why my research was on not only it wasn't just creating something more sustainable, it was creating something that was sustainable but also cheaper, because we found that if it wasn't cheaper, people weren't necessarily taking it up unless regulation was in place. And a lot of companies were saying that they're doing all this green stuff, but really it was just because they were being made to do it by the governments. Is the mindset of, I guess, of people within the construction profession or within the industry, is their view changing around sustainability more from just being, this is something we have to do, to something that they actually want to do? Will companies pay more for the benefits?
Yes, essentially they will. They can actually see. No, absolutely. Let's start off on the real positive news that effectively companies will pay more, clients will pay more, contractors will pay more for a green product, but it has to be made easy for them.
Yeah.
They don't want to do the additional work. I think it goes back to partly your research, effectively, once it's research phase or a pilot phase for a project, effectively, things are so much more expensive because small producer, maybe even working out of, a small industrial unit or whatever, they don't have the supply chain or the means or the capability to provide what's required. Now, you can get, ultra green bricks from, sort of like places like Holland. Yes, the cost is marginally more. That's not too bad. But then when you ask them, oh, I need something for, sort of like 10 houses, they'll say, yeah, we can plug you into our system. Right. Okay. We can have you those bricks for next year. So a 12-month lead-in time means that it's not possible for contractors to actually do. So there's a range of different bits that have to be made easy. In terms of things that are easy and green, I think most contractors are waking up to the fact, and they are basically saying, well, if it's not going to change my processes, it's not going to change my insurance, let's just do it. Let's just do it, sort of like, all right, okay, it might require a couple of days extra work. It might be a week more in terms of lead-in time. They're willing to take those risks now, which previously, sort of like you'd go to a contractor and say, no, I've been doing this for 30 years. You don't tell me what to do. I've used this product. I trust this product. That's what I'm using. Don't tell me any otherwise. I think people are really quite a bit more open-minded about that now.
Is there enough, because I know, for the benefit of the audience, you've done your PhD, you've been in academia, you've been in research. Is there enough research being done into new materials, new sustainable building materials?
I think there is, but you have to do a lot of digging around for it. And this is kind of a larger subject, effectively, how industry and academia interface. Sort of like there is some of that sort of like spin out company type ideals within universities, but it's still quite fledgling. It's not really, what universities do. And if you want to really accelerate this, then there has to be more grants, essentially, within things, especially which are sort of like infrastructure, the building industry, to actually provided by government to make sure that those products get off the ground and get through that pilot phase so that effectively, yes, you can build 10 houses with it. Yes, a small developer can legitimately use that product and use it safely with the correct amount of certification, and it's had the correct amount of testing done. Sort of like, I'm not going to advocate effectively something that is completely experimental going from a university into a building. Buildings last a long time. They should be tested and properly tested. But there has to be that intermediate step, and nobody is really filling into that gap at the moment.
Is there a common, I guess, theme in this? So you mentioned that, you just as a throwaway example, like greener bricks from Holland. Like, is there a specific? Is it the way they're made? Is it the materials they're made from? What is it that makes these materials, such as those, greener? Is there a common thing that you want to eliminate from the production of materials that makes them greener?
What makes them greener? It actually goes back to circularity, I would say. It's effectively using waste materials and then more than actually recycling them, more repurposing them, remanufacturing them into something else.
Is there anything out there, I mean, this for the architects listening, are there any materials out there at the minute that are feasible to use at large scale?
Feasible to use at large scale for what purpose? Sorry, I'm going to sort of like, facade materials.
Because I know that like years ago, I remember hearing about like hempcrete, and you hear about the different greener alternatives to the traditional building materials. Is this all still just, you can achieve it on a small house, but like you said, if you had a housing development, you wouldn't be able to get the materials in time. Is there anything that, I don't know, anything out there that is actually, feasible for you to use on your project, whether that be for cladding or for, anything within the building?
Right. Okay. I'm going to give a cheeky answer to this. That's why I'm smiling. I'd actually say that what we're not doing sufficiently of is actually remining the environment. Right. So actually mining the city, using the city effectively as the palette of materials for the future.
Mm-hmm.
While I was at Z Factory on previous projects, I used quite a lot of reclaimed materials. Reclaimed materials are a bit of a pain,
Mm-hmm.
require extra drying time, sorting out, sort of like remanufacture.
Yeah.
But effectively, in terms of a life cycle analysis, they're near zero carbon material.
Mm-hmm.
Their first life, effectively, they've expended their carbon, so you're getting them at a reasonably, you're getting them at a very, very low rate.
Mm-hmm.
We should be looking at the city as a material bank and actually harvesting as much from the demolition trades
Mm-hmm.
and reclaiming those materials as much as possible. And that's feasible and available now. It's just the logistics of it is quite hard to do. But if that could scale up, that would be the greenest material that we could use.
Yeah. Is there enough being done? Like, is this part of the university course? Like, are architects coming out of university being aware of this? Because surely at some point we have to stop seeing sustainable architecture as its own separate subject and see sustainable architecture just as part of the profession, the everyday working of an architect.
From my experience, effectively, architecture schools are still quite a way behind.
Mm.
There is some schools that effectively are advocating environmental architecture as a broader theme and talking about more in depth about individual pieces. But I don't think I've seen a course yet that actually joins up those pieces sufficiently so that it effectively enables a designer to actually say, this is how I'm going to design. Quite a lot of the architecture courses have sort of like a very, very simplistic view of what environmental architecture is. And that's effectively some path diagrams, which way is the wind coming from, more of the sort of site analysis side. But they don't really develop that into how buildings should actually be designed.
Do you think we'll ever reach a time where, without doing away with your role as a specialist in sustainability?
I'm quite happy to do away with my role.
Yeah, do you think there will be a time where the stuff that you're advocating and the kind of the analysis you're doing on the projects right now will just be something that an architect does, as part of their role?
I would say that there's a few people at Perkins Will that are getting to that stage now. All right, perhaps not in the whole sort of like range of different typologies that I deal with, but I can point to people, say in interior design department, and I can point to designers, and basically they are good, if not better than myself, at choosing materials that are good on a circularity basis, know the right questions to ask, know the correct aesthetic that they want to go for, and know how to actually talk to the client to make sure that that's implemented.
What a shame that has to just be learned within practice, though, and that it's kind of it's up to the practice you work for to educate you in that way of working, right? When it's an issue that needs to be tackled at scale, it's not just going to be tackled by one practice at a time, like one project at a time. It needs to be something that everybody's getting involved in.
Well, it's sort of like, I think it's mindset more than anything else. I think most of the time, and this is just throughout my career, I've always found that effectively changing people's minds to actually do things in a slightly different way, design in a slightly different process, is a harder step that they need to take. If you could get over that step, then everything else is easy. I could probably teach anybody within 6 months everything that I know about environmental architecture, but what use would that be, and would they be able to implement it is another matter. It's actually getting to the right designers and basically changing their mindsets a little bit to say, instead of designing in this way, design in this way, then effectively that opens the floodgates.
Great. Well, while you're giving out advice, I've got a question for you for the people listening, that because there's going to be tons of people listening who are architects, who have an interest in sustainability, not necessarily at the same level that you have, or probably don't work in practices where they can implement it as much, but want to do their bit towards whatever little contribution they can make to making the projects they work on most sustainable. I guess in your opinion, are there any kind of just small, are there any common, like small or simple changes that architects can implement that would have an impact on the overall sustainability of their buildings, kind of cross-sector?
I'll give you another cheeky answer to that. I would say give the M&E engineer a hard time. That's what you could do as an architect. You need to be able to challenge, and you need to be able to know effectively the basics of systems designs, both within, a household scale in terms of whole house MVHR systems, and at larger scales in terms of ventilation systems, in terms of supplies and extracts, where your, sort of like where your air is coming from, where's your cooling coming from, where's your heating coming from. Understand those concepts, and those are pretty much where the biggest gains can be made, because they can influence your architecture. Still today, we are seeing too many office buildings that you can't open the windows. They're not mixed mode ventilation. They're not naturally ventilated for some portion of the year, and they should be. Sort of like there's no reason. The UK is a very, very temperate climate. It is probably the ideal place to have a building in some sort of senses, because a good proportion of the year you could just open the windows, and as long as you keep the rain out, you're fine. The temperature's okay. But we still want to seal up our buildings completely and provide them completely in terms of mechanical ventilation. And that effectively needs to stop, and stop soon.
Great piece of advice. Thank you, Asif. I'm sure everyone listening is going to be they're going to be straight onto the, implementing that. I wanted to talk specifically about, I guess, your approach to a project. And I know we'd mentioned about there was a project that you'd worked on, the European Commission building in Brussels that you've been involved in. Could you, I guess, talk to us about, give us an overview of that project, and I suppose what your process was, how it impacted, what you suggested, how it's impacted the overall sustainability. Can you just give us an overview of it?
Right. Okay. Well, that's quite a large project to talk about. And sort of like, okay, that was a competition essentially, and the program for that competition was quite complicated. But the first step, effectively, of doing that is effectively, unfortunately, it goes back to the Lego bricks again. Effectively, you have to get what different colored Lego bricks do you have within that building, and how can those different functions complement each other? If one was heat producing, could it be put something that was cold producing, something that needed more cooling, something that needed more heating? So you're mixing up, so you're trying to even out temperatures throughout the building, depending on the orientation, where it is within the building vertically. Then you're starting to look at the mechanical systems and actually looking at how heat is delivered, coolth is delivered, lighting levels. Well, where are the places that need the most lighting? They need to be closer to the facade. What sort of light do they need? Do they need even light in terms of, say, a north light, or something that could be more directional? If you want a building to be reasonably controllable, you want to make it sure that it's as south-facing as possible. The devil, effectively, for an environmental architect is always east and west. If you could have just north-south facing buildings, it's quite ideal, because you can control quite a lot of the temperature, daylight, direct solar gain. Soon as you have east and west, then you've got this, quite a lot of uncontrollability throughout the year. And what you're trying to do is try to temper that controllability. And then it's talking to the M&E engineer, talking through different systems, and making sure that you're providing the right system at the right place at the right time of the year. It's not good enough to just basically say, right, okay, we're just going to put in one system and it's going to serve everything, because that's not quite right. And it's almost slightly lazy. You have to start on the ideal, and then unfortunately it has to dial its way back. And yes, you might end up with 2 or 3 systems, but sort of like, at least you're making an informed choice of what you're doing, rather than saying effectively, oh, we'll just put a VAB system for the whole lot.
Awesome. And when you work on a project like that, is it just you coming in and giving suggestions about areas for improvement from sustainability? Is there a big team working on it? Has everybody got knowledge of sustainability in the design of the building?
I am trying to educate as I go along. So most of the time, I'm just asking the questions, and I'm just the one that just effectively is saying, oh, have you thought about this? Which way is the sun coming from?
Yeah.
Which way is the wind coming from? Is that going to cause a downdraft in this location here? What's a pedestrian going to feel like down at the bottom of that tower?
Yeah.
So it's me just most of the time asking the right questions at the right time. And I probably would say that that's probably half of my role, is asking the right questions and the right prompts at the right time. So people think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I'll ask somebody. I hadn't thought of that. No, we'll have a look at that. Because buildings are complicated things, sort of like, I think it's all too easy for lots of people to see big name architects basically do a scribble on a piece of paper. Most of the time that's post-rationalized, but we won't go there. But a scribble on a sheet of paper and that becomes the building. No, but sort of like to actually implement how to actually deliver a building is a very, very complicated job and takes a lot of time. And essentially it's sort of like it's undervalued within our society. If you were to, sort of like think about bringing up kids effectively, how long does it take to bring up a child? They leave home 18, maybe 20, maybe even longer. But we are designing buildings that are going to last a lifetime, literally one human lifetime. And yet we're expected to do it in 2 or 3 years and just set it free into the world.
Such an interesting way of putting it. But it's true. No, that's it. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the guys, so it must be great for the people at Perkins and Will to be able to kind of benefit from this, I guess, advice and your input on kind of upskilling some of those in sustainability. What was it about, I guess, coming on to Perkins and Will? What was it about Perkins and Will that that made you? Why did you join? Why did you choose Perkins and Will to do this role? Because I'm sure many practices would benefit from this advice that you're able to give. What was it about Perkins and Will that kind of drew you to it?
Well, it's sort of like from a personal point of view, the leadership at Perkins and Will came to me and basically say, we want to change the way we design. We see that we're not designing in the right way. Help us. This is the sort of stuff that we do. And also, sort of like you mentioned 2,500 people. There's a lot more cleverer people than me around the world, sort of like doing different bits and pieces within sustainability. So in Canada, in the US, and to be able to draw on those resources for me to actually learn stuff and actually translate that back to people within the practice and also give my knowledge, because I don't know everything. I'm learning all of the time. And, sort of like, I think lockdown's been particularly a little bit hard actually in terms of that, because there's been so many webinars and other things that, sort of like you think that you're always missing out and that you should always be learning. So from a personal point of view, lockdowns have been a bit hard for me because I've been watching lots and lots of webinars, trying to learn more. And that's part of the process. It's for me to be learning, distilling, and then effectively translating onto people at Perkins and Will in the practice.
Oh, that's brilliant. It seems that sustainability and being a greener approach to design is a hot topic at the minute, which is good. Like, more people are talking about it, and there are resources out there. There are videos out there, a lot of them with you in them, talking about sustainability. I guess, why is it, from an architect watching this who's considering their career, why is it an exciting time to be an architect focused on sustainable architecture right now?
Well, probably the reason why you probably see videos of me is because people are more willing to listen. I've been chatting about this for a long time. Sort of like people like Bill Dunster and other people have been shouting this for a very, very long time. It's not that these people have just appeared. I think things have changed over the last 5 years, that it seemed to be a necessity. It's no longer a fringe sort of like, for want of a better expression, crazy hippie, sort of like left field, sort of like, oh, these people want us to, live off nothing, sort of like this sacrifice type. No, it's more that we want to increase the quality of life, but do it in the most efficient means possible. And for anybody, I think all architects should actually be taking this on. I don't think it's people should be saying, oh, I want to get into sustainability. Sustainability is part and parcel of what you do. It's it's part of the system that you have to be thinking about, because if you don't, then effectively you're just going to fall by the wayside, to be quite honest, because either you become a stylistic architect or you actually properly engage in architecture and you deal with this head on.
Well, from what you've just said, you might have already answered this question, but because I want to put myself in the mindset of some of the viewers who are listening, because anyone who's watching this is going to have an interest in sustainability, or at least enough that they want to hear more about it. If someone's an architect who's watched you and likes what you're talking about and wants to pursue a career in more sustainable architecture, but have never had the opportunity to really learn about it or implement it or do it, from the people that you've hired or that you've worked with who hadn't done sustainability, who haven't had any idea about sustainability and now do, are there any kind of common skills or experience that suits them well in terms of being able to develop down that? Are there any people that you've hired that have had no experience in sustainability that have done well? And what have you looked for in those sorts of people?
That's kind of a difficult one, because sort of like, I've met so many different people in terms of, and I think it's more about the open mindset more than anything else, and saying, sort of like, no, I don't have a fixed way to design. If you have a flexibility in the way that you can design, then I think that you could be open to sustainable architecture and it's not really a problem. In terms of what people can do in practice now is effectively look for that low-hanging fruit. Look at the stuff that's actually going to save your client money. There is a range of different technologies, a range of different things that will save your client money, if not in capital cost, in operational cost. And they're sort of like, you should be actually just putting those things on the table. All right, they're not interested in green architecture. They're probably interested in money more than anything else. So if you're going to say that I'm going to save you money either in the build cost or later on down the line in terms of operational cost, find out what their appetite actually is. What is there, what would they take as a payback time? 5 years? As I said, if it's 7 years, you can have a passive house. Sort of like, there's not that many passive houses around. If we all talk to our housing clients and it's saying, take 7 years investment, but I can get you a passive house, I think quite a lot of people would say, if they're thinking about it properly in terms of their mortgage period of 20 years, they would say, that's a reasonably good investment. I think I'll take that.
It's interesting that you say that, because I get the impression from people I speak to, with greatest respect, I don't think the majority of architects I speak to don't have that commercial mindset. I think of positioning things from a commercial or from a client's point of view, and able to encourage the adoption of sustainable ideas and green architecture, being able to position it in a way that interests them rather than why it makes a great building. I think,
well, it's just a role that I'm in. Effectively, it's sort of like the way that effectively, if you're in environmental architecture, it's the way you have to think, because you have to think about all of the counter arguments that are going to fly against you. It's almost reasonably similar to academia in terms of preparing for a viva. Effectively, what questions are they going to throw out to you? You look at a sheet of paper, you look at your thesis, you look at the studies that you've actually done, and you say, I know that's a slightly weak spot. How would I answer that question? I know that could have been tackled in a different way. Over sort of like more than 20 years, I've had all of these questions, and it's almost that pre-arming effectively of basically saying, sort of like, I don't believe in green architecture, I don't believe in sustainable design, because prove to me why I should care. And effectively, it's sort of like, well, you should care because the things you care about are the things that will benefit as well. It will be the commercial, it will be asset life, it will be in terms of getting value at the end of your building rather than throwing it away. There's all of those arguments all put together.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's because architecture often focuses around the empathy and being able to put yourself in the shoes of the person using the building. But this is just an example of putting yourself in the shoes of the person who's funding or wanting to construct it. So it's this, I guess, the same skill set. And yeah, and you're right. It really does tie in with academia and constantly having to be self-aware that you don't know everything and you have to answer questions and no argument is flawless. So I think that probably ties in quite well with when you said what types of people do well or could do well with it. I think you've kind of, by describing how you have to go about convincing a client to get on board with it, kind of ties in with what you said about open-mindedness. And I suppose one thing that must be the case with this topic as a whole is that it's constantly evolving. There's new stuff to learn. Yeah. Where are there any like resources or places to learn that you would recommend people watching this video who want to find out more check out? Are there, like, I don't know, online learning or things that people can look at?
There's a range of different sources, but I'm just trying to think of a source that effectively encompasses quite a lot. Sort of RIBA bookshop in terms of sort of like texts and stuff. See what other people are reading. Also, sort of like places like UK Green Building Council. They have a range of different toolkits and criteria and definitions, because all of these definitions are kind of hard won and hard fought. It was kind of interesting going through the definitions at the start of this, sort of like this interview. It's or this chat. It's interesting because there's so much time and effort being put into those definitions. You wouldn't believe, because it's going back to academia. If you don't know what you're measuring, how can you measure it?
Yeah.
So it's a case of finding out what that definition actually is and pinning that down properly to actually know what the boundaries of your study actually is. What is the boundaries of your remit and what is the boundaries of your building?
Do you know what? There's just so much I could sit here and ask you questions for hours. There's just so much that we could talk about. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface on quite a lot of the topics that we spoke about. So maybe hopefully one day a follow-up interview where we can dig down into a few topics a bit more deep. But I suppose to round off the chat, a question that I ask everybody would be to get your thoughts on what's an important topic in architecture that you feel not enough people are talking about or addressing?
Not enough people are talking about or addressing. I suppose it goes back to effectively that peak load. I've got a feeling that most people are quite happy to talk about stuff over, sort of like sort of net zero carbon is over a year. Sort of like whole life carbon is over, sort of like a 60 year for, certain buildings. And you're doing a certain amount of future gazing and you're not sure exactly, sort of like what the scenario is, but you're putting forward a proposal, a model. But very few people are actually talking about the peaks. Sort of like, sort of like what happens really at the start of a building. How can you reduce that and actually spread it all the way along? In the same way with mechanical system, how do you stop those peaks happening and how you actually spread it out? Because it's a question of capacity. A recent study by UK government pretty much said that if the whole of the country was going to turn to electrical heating, then you'll need 3 times the capacity in the electrical grid. We just wouldn't have enough electrical grid. It's going to come down to a battle on capacity and bandwidth, to use the data term. So we've got to make sure that we're actually reducing that. And that is probably the hottest topic that is not being fully addressed at the moment.
Completely agree. Well, look, thank you. So once again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really, really interesting having a chat. I really hope there are listeners and viewers who have taken something away from this. Look, thanks again for coming on. Thanks again for anyone who's watched this and listened. For more information, I'm going to link in the description for the video. If you want to find out more about Perkins and Will, about Asif Din's work, about Lofthouse Group, feel free. You can find it all there. But yeah, thanks for joining us again. See you next time. And thanks once again for Asif for coming on.
Thank you.